In the summer of 1940, the world held its breath. The map of Europe was ablaze, Nazi banners fluttered over Paris, and the armies of Adolf Hitler seemed unstoppable. One by one, nations had fallen: Poland, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. In just a matter of months, the German war machine had crushed all resistance, leaving only a single, defiant island standing in its path: Britain. Across the English Channel, the white cliffs of Dover stood as a stark, silent promise. The British people, battered but unbowed, watched the horizon for the dark shapes of enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe's bombers roared overhead, their engines a constant reminder that the threat of invasion was not just possible, but imminent. In the streets of London, Coventry, and Liverpool, the wail of air raid sirens became a nightly ritual, and families huddled in shelters as bombs rained down from the sky. Yet despite the terror and destruction, Britain did not yield. The government, led by Winston Churchill, refused to consider surrender. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity that stunned even their adversaries. Ordinary citizens, men, women, and children, displayed a quiet courage that would become legendary. The world watched in awe as the island nation, isolated and seemingly doomed, refused to break. But perhaps the most surprising observers were not in New York or Moscow, but in Berlin. Within the marble halls and smoky war rooms of the German High Command, generals who had expected a swift British capitulation found themselves confounded. Reports from the front lines spoke of British resolve, of a people who would not be cowed. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, a grudging respect began to grow among the German officers. Britain, they realized, was not just another domino to be toppled. It was an unbreakable island, one that would change the course of the war and the world. To truly understand the shock and awe that Britain's resistance inspired, even among its enemies, we must first step back into the chaos of 1940. Europe was not just at war, it was in ruins. The German Blitzkrieg, a new and terrifying form of warfare, had swept across the continent with breathtaking speed. In less than a year, Hitler's armies had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and most devastatingly, France. The fall of France in June of 1940 was a seismic event. The French army, once considered among the strongest in the world, collapsed in just 6 weeks. Paris, the city of light, fell under the shadow of the swastika. The British Expeditionary Force, sent to aid their French allies, barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, leaving behind most of their equipment and thousands of prisoners. The miracle of Dunkirk, where over 300,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated across the Channel, was a rare glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark time. But hope was in short supply. With France defeated, Britain stood alone. The Soviet Union, bound by a non-aggression pact with Germany, was not yet an enemy. The United States, though sympathetic, remained officially neutral. Across the Channel, the might of the Third Reich was massing for what seemed like the inevitable next step: the invasion of Britain. The situation was dire. The British Army was battered and under-equipped. The Royal Air Force, though valiant, was outnumbered by the Luftwaffe. The Royal Navy, stretched thin by global commitments, faced the daunting prospect of defending the home islands from a seaborne assault. In London, the government braced for the worst. Many in the war cabinet believed that invasion was only a matter of time. Outside observers, too, doubted Britain's chances. American newspapers speculated about how long the island could hold out. Soviet diplomats quietly wondered if they should prepare for a world where Nazi Germany dominated all of Western Europe. Even within Britain, there were voices of fear and uncertainty. Some politicians urged negotiation, believing that survival depended on making peace with Hitler. Yet against all logic and expectation, Britain refused to yield. The government, under Winston Churchill's indomitable leadership, rallied the nation with stirring speeches and unshakable resolve. The people, weary but determined, prepared for the worst. Sandbags lined the streets, blackout curtains covered every window, and children were evacuated from the cities. The phrase, "we shall never surrender," became more than just words. It was a promise. This was the context in which German generals viewed Britain's stand. From their perspective, the island's isolation was total, its defeat seemingly inevitable. They had seen nation after nation crumble before their Wehrmacht. Why should Britain be any different? And yet, as the months dragged on and the British refused to break, a sense of disbelief and, eventually, respect began to take root among the German high command. Britain's stand was not just unexpected, it was unprecedented. In the aftermath of Dunkirk, as the battered remnants of the British Expeditionary Force retreated across the Channel, the mood inside the German high command was one of triumph and anticipation. The speed and scale of their victories had exceeded even their own expectations. France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway had all fallen in rapid succession. The British, having lost most of their heavy equipment and forced into a desperate evacuation, seemed to be on the brink of collapse. For many in Berlin, the question was not if Britain would surrender, but when.
Adolf Hitler himself was convinced that the British would soon come to the negotiating table. He saw the British as fellow Aryans, and despite his deep-seated animosity toward the British Empire, he believed that they would recognize the futility of further resistance. In his mind, the fall of France had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe. With the continent under German control, Hitler assumed that the British government would seek terms to preserve its empire and avoid further destruction. This belief was widely shared among the German military leadership. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, expressed confidence that Britain would sue for peace. General Alfred Jodl, another key figure in the German command structure, predicted that the British would not risk the annihilation of their homeland. Even Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, boasted that the Royal Air Force would be swept from the skies, leaving Britain defenseless and ripe for invasion or capitulation. The German generals' expectations were shaped by both logic and precedent. Historically, Britain had often sought compromise when faced with overwhelming odds. The memory of World War I's devastation was still fresh, and many believed that the British public would not tolerate another prolonged and costly conflict. Furthermore, the rapid collapse of France, a nation with a formidable military reputation, seemed to confirm the invincibility of the German war machine. Plans for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain, were drawn up with a sense of inevitability. The German Navy, though wary of the Royal Navy's strength, began preparations for a cross-channel assault. The Luftwaffe was tasked with achieving air superiority, a prerequisite for any invasion. The expectation was that once the RAF was destroyed and the threat of invasion loomed, the British government would be forced to negotiate. Yet beneath the surface, there were voices of caution. Admiral Erich Raeder, head of the Kriegsmarine, warned that the Royal Navy remained a formidable obstacle. Some army officers, too, questioned whether an invasion was truly feasible. The English Channel, with its unpredictable weather and strong tides, posed significant logistical challenges. Still, the prevailing sentiment was one of confidence, perhaps even overconfidence. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the most significant errors of the war. The German High Command underestimated not only Britain's military capabilities, but also its national character and political will. They failed to grasp the depth of British resolve, the leadership of Winston Churchill, and the unity that adversity would inspire among the British people. As the weeks turned into months and no peace overtures came from London, frustration began to mount in Berlin. Hitler, who had initially held back from ordering a full-scale invasion in the hope of a negotiated settlement, grew increasingly impatient. The Luftwaffe's failure to break the RAF during the Battle of Britain further eroded German confidence. The realization slowly dawned that Britain was not going to surrender, no matter the odds. In hindsight, the German generals' expectations and miscalculations reveal much about the psychology of the Nazi leadership. Their belief in their own invincibility, combined with a fundamental misunderstanding of their enemy, led them to underestimate the challenge that Britain posed. It was a costly mistake, one that would shape the course of the war and haunt the German High Command for years to come. The summer of 1940 marked the beginning of one of the most pivotal and dramatic confrontations of the Second World War, the Battle of Britain. For the first time, Hitler's war machine faced a determined and resourceful enemy that refused to yield. The Luftwaffe, confident after its victories in Poland and France, launched a massive aerial assault designed to crush the RAF and pave the way for a German invasion. What followed was a contest of skill, courage, and endurance that would not only decide the fate of Britain, but also reshape German perceptions of their adversary. The Luftwaffe's campaign began in earnest in July 1940. Waves of German bombers and fighters crossed the Channel daily, targeting British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The goal was clear: achieve air superiority by destroying the RAF, thereby making Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, feasible. German commanders, including Hermann Göring, believed that the RAF would be overwhelmed within weeks. The sheer scale of the Luftwaffe's resources seemed to guarantee victory. But the RAF, though outnumbered, was far from defeated. British pilots, many of them barely out of their teens, took to the skies in Spitfires and Hurricanes, fighting with a tenacity that stunned their opponents. The British had several key advantages: an effective radar network that provided early warning of incoming raids, a well-organized command and control system, and the ability to fight over their own territory, allowing downed pilots to return to battle. The few, as Churchill would famously call them, became symbols of national defiance.
As the battle raged through August and September, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus from military targets to bombing London and other cities, a campaign that would become known as the Blitz. The hope was to break British morale and force the government to the negotiating table. Instead, the relentless attacks only steeled the resolve of the British people and their leaders. The RAF, battered but unbroken, continued to inflict heavy losses on the German bombers. Inside the German high command, the mood began to shift from confidence to frustration, and eventually to reluctant admiration. Reports from the front lines described the skill and bravery of British pilots. German ace Adolf Galland, who would later become one of the Luftwaffe's most respected commanders, famously remarked that he wished Göring would give him a squadron of Spitfires. Such comments reflected a growing respect for the RAF's aircraft and tactics. General Albert Kesselring, one of the Luftwaffe's senior commanders, acknowledged the effectiveness of British air defenses and the resilience of the population. In his memoirs, Kesselring would later write, "The British, both in the air and on the ground, showed a determination and courage that we had not anticipated. Their resistance was not only military but also psychological." This sentiment was echoed by other German officers, who began to realize that the British were not simply holding out, they were fighting back with skill and ingenuity. The failure to achieve air superiority was a turning point. By October 1940, it was clear that the Luftwaffe had suffered unsustainable losses. Over 1,700 German aircraft had been destroyed, along with many experienced pilots. The RAF, though bloodied, remained a potent force. Hitler was forced to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely, marking the first major defeat for Nazi Germany in the war. For the German generals, the Battle of Britain was a humbling experience. Their initial assumptions about British weakness had been shattered. The island nation had not only survived, but had done so with a spirit that commanded respect. In private conversations and post-war memoirs, many German officers admitted their surprise at the effectiveness of British resistance. The RAF's victory was not just a military triumph, it was a psychological blow to the myth of German invincibility. The Battle of Britain also had a profound impact on the broader course of the war. It demonstrated that Hitler's forces could be stopped, and it inspired resistance movements across occupied Europe. For the German High Command, it was a lesson in the dangers of underestimating an opponent's resolve. The respect that grew among German generals for their British counterparts was hard-won, forged in the crucible of one of history's greatest aerial battles. As the Battle of Britain raged in the skies, a new and terrifying chapter of the war began for the people of Britain, the Blitz. Starting in September 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted its strategy from targeting airfields and military installations to launching sustained bombing raids on London and other cities. A campaign that would become known as the Blitz. The hope was to break British morale and force the government to the negotiating table. Instead, the relentless attacks only steeled the resolve of the British people and their leaders. The RAF, battered but unbroken, continued to inflict heavy losses on the German bombers. Inside the German High Command, the mood began to shift from confidence to frustration, and eventually to reluctant admiration. Reports from the front lines described the skill and bravery of British pilots.
German ace Adolf Galland, who would later become one of the Luftwaffe's most respected commanders, famously remarked that he wished Goering would give him a squadron of Spitfires. Such comments reflected a growing respect for the RAF's aircraft and tactics. General Albert Kesselring, one of the Luftwaffe's senior commanders, acknowledged the effectiveness of British air defenses and the resilience of the population. In his memoirs, Kesselring would later write, "The British, both in the air and on the ground, showed a determination and courage that we had not anticipated. Their resistance was not only military but also psychological." This sentiment was echoed by other German officers who began to realize that the British were not simply holding out, they were fighting back with skill and ingenuity. The failure to achieve air superiority was a turning point. By October 1940, it was clear that the Luftwaffe had suffered unsustainable losses. Over 1,700 German aircraft had been destroyed, along with many experienced pilots. The RAF, though bloodied, remained a potent force. Hitler was forced to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely, marking the first major defeat for Nazi Germany in the war. For the German generals, the Battle of Britain was a humbling experience. Their initial assumptions about British weakness had been shattered. The island nation had not only survived, but had done so with a spirit that commanded respect. In private conversations and post-war memoirs, many German officers admitted their surprise at the effectiveness of British resistance. The RAF's victory was not just a military triumph, it was a psychological blow to the myth of German invincibility. The Battle of Britain also had a profound impact on the broader course of the war. It demonstrated that Hitler's forces could be stopped, and it inspired resistance movements across occupied Europe. For the German High Command, it was a lesson in the dangers of underestimating an opponent's resolve. The respect that grew among German generals for their British counterparts was hard-won, forged in the crucible of one of history's greatest aerial battles. As the Battle of Britain raged in the skies, a new and terrifying chapter of the war began for the people of Britain, the Blitz. Starting in September 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted its strategy from targeting airfields and military installations to launching sustained bombing raids on London and other cities. For 57 consecutive nights, London was bombed, and the campaign continued intermittently for months, spreading destruction and fear across the country. The German High Command believed that relentless bombing would break the will of the British people. The logic was simple. If civilians lost faith in their government's ability to protect them, pressure would mount on Churchill to seek peace. Factories, docks, railways, and residential neighborhoods became targets. The city of Coventry was nearly obliterated in this single night, and Liverpool, Birmingham, and other industrial centers suffered heavy losses. Fires raged, buildings crumbled, and thousands lost their lives. Yet the Blitz revealed a different side of Britain, one that even German commanders could not have anticipated. Instead of panic and collapse, the British public responded with remarkable resilience. Each night as the air raid sirens wailed, families took shelter in underground stations, basements, and makeshift bunkers. In the morning, they emerged to survey the damage, clear the rubble, and carry on with their daily lives. The phrase, "business as usual," became a badge of honor, a quiet defiance in the face of terror. The government and local authorities worked tirelessly to maintain morale. Firefighters, ambulance crews, and volunteers risked their lives to save others. The BBC broadcasted messages of hope and unity, while King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited bombed neighborhoods to show solidarity. Even as entire streets were reduced to ruins, the spirit of the people remained unbroken. For the German High Command, the Blitz was both a tactical and psychological campaign. They hoped to cripple British industry and shatter civilian morale. But as the months passed, reports from intelligence agents and aerial reconnaissance painted a different picture. Factories continued to produce, the RAF remained operational, and the population's resolve only seemed to harden. The psychological impact on the German side was profound. The expectation that Britain would crumble under sustained bombing proved to be another miscalculation. German generals began to recognize the limits of air power against a determined civilian population. In private, some expressed grudging admiration for the British ability to endure hardship. The Blitz, intended to force surrender, instead became a symbol of British endurance. It also exposed the flaws in German strategy, as resources were diverted from military targets to terror bombing, with little effect on the outcome of the war. The legacy of the Blitz was not just the physical scars left on British cities, but the psychological strength it forged in the nation. The world watched as Britain endured, and even German commanders could not help but respect the unyielding spirit of the island under fire. The Blitz had failed to break Britain. Instead, it had steeled its resolve and further confounded the expectations of the German High Command. To truly grasp how deeply Britain's resistance affected the German High Command, one must turn to the private words and reflections of the generals themselves. In diaries, memoirs, and secret reports, a complex picture emerges, one of initial confidence giving way to surprise, frustration, and eventually to reluctant admiration for the island nation that refused to yield. In the early days after Dunkirk, Betonen German correspondence was almost dismissive. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary in June 1940, "The English army is finished. Our victory is complete." This sentiment was echoed by many in the Wehrmacht, who believed that Britain's defeat was only a matter of time. Yet as the weeks passed and no peace offer came from London, the mood began to shift.
By August 1940, Halder's diary entries reveal a growing sense of unease. "The English are not behaving as we expected," he noted. "Their resistance is stubborn, and their air force is proving more effective than our intelligence suggested." This was not the quick victory the Germans had anticipated. The Luftwaffe's failure to destroy the RAF during the Battle of Britain was a particular source of frustration. General Albert Kesselring, a senior Luftwaffe commander, later admitted, "We underestimated the British. Their pilots fought with a skill and determination that surprised us all." The frustration was not limited to the air war. As the Blitz dragged on, German intelligence reports painted a picture of a population that, far from collapsing, was growing more resolute. A secret report from the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, observed, "Morale in London remains high despite heavy bombing. The people are adapting to the raids and continue their daily routines." This resilience baffled many in the German high command, who had expected the terror bombing to break the British spirit. Some German generals began to express open admiration for their adversaries. General Gunther Blumentritt, who served as chief of staff to several senior commanders, later wrote in his memoirs, "The British are a remarkable people. Their ability to endure hardship and continue fighting was something we did not fully appreciate until we faced them alone." Blumentritt also noted the role of leadership, particularly that of Winston Churchill, in sustaining British morale. Churchill's speeches and his refusal to consider surrender inspired not only his own people, but also earned the respect of his enemies. Even Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most celebrated fighter aces, could not hide his respect for the RAF. In his post-war writings, Galland recalled, "The British pilots were our equals in every way. Their Spitfires and Hurricanes were formidable opponents, and their tactics were innovative. We knew we were facing a first-class enemy." Galland's famous request to Goering for a squadron of Spitfires was more than a quip. It was an acknowledgement of the quality of British aircraft and the men who flew them. Not all German reflections were complimentary. Some generals, such as Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, expressed frustration at what they saw as British stubbornness. In a private letter, Rundstedt wrote, "The English refuse to see reason. They fight on, even when defeat is certain. It is both admirable and infuriating." This mix of respect and irritation was common among the German leadership, who struggled to reconcile their expectations with the reality of British resistance. The impact of Britain's stand was also evident in strategic discussions. Secret minutes from German high command meetings reveal growing anxiety about the failure to subdue Britain. As the war dragged on and new fronts opened in the Soviet Union and North Africa, the inability to force Britain out of the war became a persistent source of concern. General Halder's diary entry from December 1940 captures this sentiment. "We have not broken the English. Their continued resistance forces us to divide our attention." In the years after the war, many German generals reflected on their experiences with a sense of humility. In interviews and memoirs, they acknowledged that they had underestimated Britain's resolve and overestimated the effectiveness of their own strategies. General Kesselring, in his post-war writings, summed it up, "The British taught us that wars are not won by force alone. The spirit of a nation can be as formidable as any army." Through their own words, the German generals reveal a journey from arrogance to respect. Britain's 2-year solo war effort was not just a military feat, it was a psychological victory that left a lasting impression on its adversaries. The surprise, frustration, and admiration found in their diaries and reports are a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the island nation that stood alone and never quit. By the spring of 1941, the strategic landscape of the Second World War was changing rapidly. The German High Command, frustrated by its inability to bring Britain to its knees, began to look eastward.
Hitler's attention turned to the Soviet Union and the planning for Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, moved into high gear. Yet, even as the Wehrmacht prepared to launch its assault on the vast Russian front, Britain's continued resistance remained a thorn in the side of German strategy and a persistent source of anxiety for its generals. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was not taken lightly. Hitler and his generals believed that a swift victory in the East would secure Germany's dominance over Europe and eliminate the threat of a two-front war. However, the failure to defeat Britain meant that Germany could never fully concentrate its resources on the Eastern campaign. The Royal Navy still controlled the seas, and the RAF continued to pose a threat to German operations in Western Europe. British commandos launched raids along the occupied coast, and the British government provided support to resistance movements across the continent. Inside the German high command, there was a growing realization that Britain's survival had fundamentally altered the course of the war. General Halder noted in his diary, "The English problem remains unsolved. Their continued resistance forces us to divide our attention." This division of focus was not just a logistical challenge, it was a psychological one as well. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered, and the prospect of a prolonged conflict weighed heavily on the minds of the generals. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, initially brought spectacular gains for the Germans. Soviet forces were caught off guard, and vast territories fell under German control. But as the campaign dragged on and the Russian winter set in, the limitations of Germany's strategy became apparent. Supplies were stretched thin, and the hoped-for quick victory proved elusive. All the while, Britain remained defiant, launching bombing raids on German cities and forging new alliances, most notably with the United States after December 1941. The continued resistance of Britain had a profound impact on German morale. It served as a constant reminder that the war was far from over and that victory was not assured. German generals who had once expected a swift and total triumph now faced the grim reality of a drawn-out, multi-front conflict. The inability to subdue Britain haunted their strategic calculations and contributed to the growing sense of frustration and uncertainty within the high command. In the end, the shift in focus to the Soviet Union did not diminish the significance of Britain's stand. Instead, it highlighted the resilience and determination of a nation that refused to be conquered. Britain's survival ensured that Germany would never have peace in the West, and it played a crucial role in shaping the ultimate outcome of the war. The legacy of Britain's two-year solo war effort against Nazi Germany extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences of the early 1940s. For the German High Command, the experience left a deep and lasting impression, fundamentally altering their perceptions of both their enemy and the nature of modern warfare. As the war dragged on, and eventually as the Third Reich collapsed, German generals were forced to confront the reality that their assumptions about Britain and about war itself had been deeply flawed. In the years following the war, many German officers reflected on the significance of Britain's resistance. In memoirs, interviews, and post-war analyses, they acknowledged that the failure to defeat Britain in 1940-41 was a turning point. General Albert Kesselring, for example, wrote, "The British refusal to surrender, even when isolated and under constant attack, was a lesson in national willpower. It forced us to reconsider our strategies and recognize the limits of military force." This sentiment was echoed by others, who admitted that they had underestimated the psychological and political dimensions of warfare. The impact of Britain's stand was not limited to the battlefield. It influenced German military thinking in profound ways. The belief in the inevitability of quick, decisive victories, a hallmark of Blitzkrieg, was shattered. The war had become a test of endurance, resources, and morale. German generals began to appreciate that wars could not be won by military might alone. The spirit and unity of a nation could be just as decisive. This realization came too late to alter the course of the conflict, but it shaped the way many German officers viewed future military challenges. Britain's survival also had a direct effect on the outcome of the war. By holding out, Britain provided a base for Allied operations, kept the Atlantic supply lines open, and served as a beacon of hope for occupied Europe. The eventual entry of the United States and the Soviet Union into the war created a coalition that Germany could not defeat. Many German generals later admitted that the inability to knock Britain out of the war in 1940–41 was a strategic disaster from which the Reich never recovered. In post-war Germany, the story of Britain's resistance became a subject of study and, in some circles, admiration. Military academies analyzed the Battle of Britain and the Blitz as examples of effective defense and civilian resilience. The leadership of Winston Churchill, the adaptability of the RAF, and the unity of the British people were cited as key factors in the Allied victory. For many former German officers, these lessons were sobering reminders of the dangers of arrogance and the importance of understanding one's enemy. The legacy of Britain's stand also extended to the broader narrative of World War II. It became a symbol of hope and defiance, inspiring resistance movements across Europe and shaping the post-war order. For the German generals who had once expected an easy victory, it was a humbling experience, one that forced them to confront the limits of power and the unpredictability of history. In the end, Britain's refusal to surrender changed not only the course of the war, but also the minds of those who had sought its defeat. The respect and sometimes awe expressed by German generals in their later years stands as a testament to the enduring power of courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds.